Tonight on Primetime Politics, let the campaign begin.
This is a tax cut that will put Canada first.
I think in this election, the question is, who's going to build homes you can actually afford?
We're acting by putting more money in Canadians' pockets through a middle-class tax cut that I announced yesterday.
Party leaders make their way across the country, making the pitch to Canadian voters ahead of an April 28th election. We'll get into what's already been said on this day 2 of the campaign. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Canada's 45th general election is now underway, with April 28th now set as Election Day. And party leaders starting their campaigns, with the Liberal leader Mark Carney in Newfoundland talking about Canada-U.S. relations. The Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was in the Toronto area today talking tax cuts. The NDP leader Jagmeet Singh in Montreal talking housing. And as for the Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, well, he is in Quebec City pitching a Buy Quebec and Buy Canadian policy for the federal government. Here to talk about the start of the campaign, we're now joined by Stephanie Levitz, senior reporter with the Globe and Mail, Chris Nardi, parliamentary reporter with the National Post. Hello to the two of you.
Hello.
Hello. So listen, you know, I don't know if it's strange, but I do want to talk about, first and foremost, the Liberal leader, because unlike the other leaders today, Mark Carney made new promises on this. You know, it's the second day, but it's the Monday of the campaign. What he does, though, is lean into this Canada-U.S. relations while in Gander, Newfoundland. What do you make of that kind of move, Stephanie? And I think fair to acknowledge the fact that Donald Trump has helped Carney and the Liberal campaign up until this point.
You can unpack it a bunch of different ways. I mean, one way to unpack it is that Mark Carney is seen by his detractors and even by some of his supporters as a big city guy. I mean, he can, you know, he talks about being from northern Canada and his roots in Edmonton, but he's like an urban guy. To start his campaign in earnest in Gander, Newfoundland, that's getting out of the main cities. That's going to a region where the Liberals, until he came along, were going to lose all of their support. And so going right to where things were riskiest for him politically, for that party, that's an interesting move. And of course, then it leads into this brand, this Captain Canada mantle that he's trying to put on for himself. I found it interesting, as you sort of allude to, because this election, obviously, the Liberals would like to fight it on Trump and, you know, and being the best steward or the best champion of Canada against Trump. That sounds then like they don't want to actually fight it on policy. They don't want to fight it on ideas. They don't want to fight it on substance. They want to fight it on branding. And on the first full day of this campaign, they started with branding.
Yeah, interesting point. Chris, what would you say to that?
Well, I'd say that, I mean, I was too surprised, quite frankly, for the first full day of campaigning. I thought they'd be rushing out to make an announcement. And it's actually been, I'm not going to say calm by any means, but it's been quieter in a sense. But I'm not fully surprised that they didn't have any big resounding, because I'm assuming that they're building platforms. And right now, Mark Carney, as Stephanie so elegantly said, is really just trying to get out there and make himself known outside of the large urban centers. He spent time in Ottawa. He started kind of his leadership campaign. He did start in Edmonton. He's obviously trying to decentralize it a little bit, but I do fundamentally think the Liberals will end up spending a lot of time in this campaign in the Greater Toronto area, in Quebec, in Montreal specifically. The Atlantic region did absolutely look like it was going to be partly, or at least partly lost to them. It actually looks like they've reversed a lot of those tides with this renewal in support that they've seen in the polls. But Trump was always going to be the question of these elections, doing this press conference in Gander where they can say, you know, look, Donald Trump, we're here for you on 9/11. Now you stop attacking us. And trying to send that message to Trump before he even speaks to him, the president, is an interesting gambit. And I don't think it's lost on Canadians necessarily.
Yeah, you mentioned Toronto, and I want to note the fact that that is where Pierre Poilievre, in fact, you know, not long after finishing up his first campaign speech yesterday, makes his way to the Greater Toronto area. He continues to be there talking about tax cuts. You know, does that say anything about the strategy for Conservatives right now? Because the numbers have tightened up in the GTA, because at one point they were very much in the lead when you even factored in the 416, the city of Toronto itself.
I wouldn't say that this is any strategic shift for the Conservatives. They always knew that, you know, the road to a majority is going to go through the Toronto suburbs and sort of the lower mainland of British Columbia. I'd submit that their election plans, such as if there was one, say 6 months ago, probably looked a lot like what we've seen in the last 24 hours, right? Big rally event kickoff in Ottawa, do a big rah-rah that night, next day start hitting the GTA. 'Twas ever thus for Conservative campaigns as they've been on a road to a majority. The interesting thing, I guess, though, is in the context of this shift in this campaign, that it's about Donald Trump, that we have a new Liberal leader, that the package that Pierre Poilievre put before voters, again on this, like the 2 election days we've seen, was just like any other campaign, except this isn't just like any other campaign. His team seems to believe at the end of the day, the ballot box question, yes, it is Trump, yes, it is that anxiety, but will remain, am I better off today than I was the last time I cast a ballot? Who will make me better off tomorrow?
Yeah, in fact, there was this great article, the headline, focusing on the Liberal record, Stephanie Levitz, that I read. So, but hey, what do you make of the fact that the Conservatives have spent the first 24 hours in the GTA?
Well, I mean, to Steph's point, they can't win without it. They need it. The road to a Conservative minority government is extremely narrow, and in fact has narrowed tremendously, quasi-inexistent, quite frankly, I think, now that the Liberals have appear to have taken up so much more ground in the polls. So they're going to focus on the areas that they want. Speaking to his team, I'm not going to say they've given up on making major inroads in Quebec, but they haven't not given up on that, in the sense that they don't see now, with Pierre not leading by 20 points, making big gains in Quebec, which means that likely those seats either go back to the Liberals, the Liberals even make maybe gains, or the Bloc stays strong. But ultimately, it's not in Quebec where they're going to get them. So they'll focus on the areas that they don't already consider to be kind of captured. I think in the prairies, they're going to go to BC. I think they'll spend some time in the Atlantic too. I think there's at least 2 of the 4 provinces that they think they can still make some inroads in, at the very least. But I'm not surprised he's going to do these big rallies. It's a show, and it was impressive. Quite frankly, you could tell that the atmosphere through CPAC was electrifying. Great channel. But you could tell that the atmosphere was electric and electrifying, and that he is really focusing on the fact that Canadians are concerned about affordability, whether it was because of the Trudeau Liberal policies, as they would say, or if it was because Trump's tariffs are making things unaffordable. They do think that the pocketbook is going to be the key issue.
Yeah, it's something we're going to have to watch. And, a pocketbook a little bit was what the NDP was leaning on today as well, because here we see Jagmeet Singh in Montreal and talking about housing, which, arguably, Steph, is probably the only in for the NDP at this point, because they're struggling in numbers, but to try to make a progressive argument up against 2 business arguments is probably their way in. Would you agree with that?
Housing is one, any sort of social safety net kind of conversation, right? So I expect we'll hear more about dental, more about pharma, maybe something more about childcare and getting that piece too. But I think for the New Democrats, really, Mark Carney, in the way he has structured his cabinet, in this way he is trying to pull the Liberals back to the center, potentially has opened up a progressive voter for the New Democrats that they have seen leave them in favor of the Liberals over the last number of years. I mean, think about, all of the cabinet positions suddenly non-existent for Mark Carney, gender, diversity, inclusion, people with disabilities. When that issue was put to Jagmeet Singh, he said, yeah, progressive voters, come home to us. This is not your guy. So it's interesting, again, in these first 2 days that he's going on a housing issue, which, if I'm not mistaken, the policies on that are pretty well entrenched with all the parties, and not sort of making that more emotional play to voters, that these guys are business elites. It's not about your pocketbook, it's about your values. Jagmeet Singh is not yet making a value set argument, and it'll be interesting to see if he gets to one.
Yeah, Chris?
I actually think it's interesting because Jagmeet's, it's kind of in a weird place, stuck between a rock and a hard place. So as the Carney Liberals kind of shift towards the right, or the center, as Stephanie said, it's leaving this void. But then a lot of the kind of traditional voters that he would have tried to get on the progressive left, the union vote, the blue-collar people that would have been seduced by the safety net votes, Pierre has been coming in from the right towards the left and grabbing them a little bit like the progressive Conservatives in Ontario did with Doug Ford, right? They're trying to make themselves the working man party. Pierre Poilievre made all sorts of announcements, I think it was late last week, or maybe early in the campaign, about how he's going to help tradespeople. Boots, not suits is one of his new slogans. So it's interesting because Jagmeet Singh is trying to go back and recapture a lot of the kind of left, more progressive part of Canadians that had gone towards the Trudeau Liberals, but that support had also been eaten at by an unexpected, I think, foe or political foe, which is Pierre Poilievre. And I do question how much of that is left for him when all is said and done.
Yeah, well, we're going to speak to Éric Grenier a little later in the program, so we'll get into that. Chris Nardi, Stephanie Levitz, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I always appreciate the time with you, too. Well, listen, as this 45th general election campaign gets underway, Elections Canada is telling Canadians to be on the lookout for disinformation and also to be wary of any information about the voting process that cannot be verified on the Elections Canada website. In fact, that site has a new online tool. It's called ElectoFacts to help Canadians out. And Canada's chief electoral officer has also written to social media platforms asking for their help to monitor their own apps.
I have written to all of the key social media platforms to engage them and seek their support to making this election a secure election. And as we've discussed before, we have a range of information products about the electoral process that are there to help Canadians see clearly about what's true. We did receive some responses from X in particular, for example, from TikTok. Responses that they accept that there is a concern about the synthetic content that can be misleading, and that they have committed to taking action in that regard. So we'll see what happens during the election if their commitment holds true, but they have made that commitment.
Now, the issue of foreign interference was also addressed today. 5 senior civil servants making up the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol Panel. Now, they are in fact briefed by the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections or SITE group, and it's up to this panel to flag any foreign interference threats. And as this campaign gets its start, well, here's what we heard from them today.
PRC officials and proxies are likely to conduct foreign interference activity using a complex array of both overt and covert mechanisms. We have also seen that the government of India has the intent and capability to interfere in Canadian communities and democratic processes to assert its geopolitical influence. For its part, Russia has undertaken sustained efforts to build dissemination networks across social media and news websites that repurpose and amplify Kremlin talking points. The government of Pakistan could potentially conduct foreign interference activities against Canada, in line with its strategic aims to promote political, security, and economic stability in Pakistan and to counter India's growing global influence.
Do you see any threats from far-right groups in the U.S. To interfere in Canada's election, like the MAGA group?
Vanessa? Thank you for the question. So the SITE Task Force and all of its members will continue to monitor the election and any instances of potential foreign interference throughout it. We will look at it from the perspective of foreign interference and violent extremist groups. And in cases where those might intersect, they would certainly come to the attention of our members.
So, election monitoring is underway by public officials, and monitoring the polls and interpreting what it means for us, well, we have Éric Grenier for that. He joins us right now, the founder and the writer behind The Writ. Éric, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So, you know, in coming up with your numbers here, you've looked at the 4 of the latest surveys, and when you look at the range here, one has a 6-point lead for the Liberals. It goes also another poll with Abacus, 3-point lead for the Conservatives. What do you make of these numbers?
Well, it does show that we're in a close race, right? When you do get to this point where you're starting to have some polls that are putting one party ahead and some other polls are putting another party ahead, that you're looking at primarily a tied race. But I think the bulk of the polls that we've seen, and there is some more that was coming out today, do suggest that if you have to say that who is on the better side of that tie, it is the Liberals. The Liberals have been leading in most of those polls, and in some of the ones that we've seen, the lead has been big enough that you would, say it's outside of the margin of error. You also see from those polls that the NDP's numbers have come down a lot. We've seen polls in the 10 to 12% range, 13%, but we also have seen some polls at 9 or 8% for the NDP. So it's clear that they are in trouble and that there's a tie at the top of the table. But probably if you have to give to someone, the Liberals look like they're in the front-runner position as this campaign begins.
And is that because Liberals historically have a more efficient vote?
In terms of the seats, absolutely, right? Because this is how it's like, there's 2 different things running here. There's the national polls, which are very close. So Canadians are split between the Liberals and the Conservatives. But in terms of seats, it is not very close. With the kind of numbers that we've seen, even a poll like the Abacus poll, where the Conservatives were ahead by 3 points, you'd probably still give the Liberals the edge in the seats. In the polls where they are ahead by 2, 3, or more points, you would absolutely give them the advantage and put them in a majority position. We saw in the last 2 elections, they had 1 point less than the Conservatives in terms of the overall vote, but they won nearly 40 more seats. If they are ahead by a couple points or even tied, they start to crest to that level of 172 seats or more and in that majority position. So it is right now close race nationally in the polls. Favorite for the Liberals in terms of the seats.
Okay, and in terms of seat projection, like roughly speaking, what do you, because it looks like you have the Liberals, when you crunch the numbers yourself, it looks like you have the Liberals in majority territory right now if the vote were today.
Yeah, absolutely. The Liberals would be just over the majority threshold. So my projections have them just a little bit over 172, south of 180, so somewhere around 175, 177. The Conservatives would be winning more seats, probably 130, 135, something like that. The NDP is a bit of the wild card here, because when you look at just the numbers, the NDP would be in dire straits to win almost any seats. The projections have them winning 6, 7 seats, something like that.
So not even official party status.
Not even close to official party status. But will some of those incumbents be able to buck that trend? Will they be able to survive thanks to their own profile? If the election were today. Obviously, if the election's in 5 weeks, things are going to change, and the NDP is going to be able to make that point that, you know, we should be there as an opposition party in a minority parliament. But right now, it looks like it's a two-horse race. The Bloc Québécois is also on the table in Quebec, but other than that, it's between the Liberals and the Conservatives, with the Liberals being in that pole position to form another government.
Okay, so what does that mean for the Greens then? Because right now they're at 2 seats, and arguably, for Green supporters, those are high-profile candidates for them. Where is that party right now?
They are in trouble as well. We've seen a lot of polls that have had them sometimes at 2 or 3%. And in the last election, they had just over 2% of the vote. But that was they didn't run a full slate of candidates. This time they are aiming to run a full slate. But we're not seeing that the party is back to the 4, 5, 6% that they've been in previous elections. I think that for their campaign, it's going to be primarily to get Mike Morris reelected in Kitchener Centre, Elizabeth May in Sandwich Gulf Islands. That one might be in more danger than Morris in Kitchener Centre. Jonathan Pedneau is running Outremont on the island of Montreal. That is going to be a tough seat for him to win, but maybe he can at least boost the Greens numbers. We're not seeing that they have a boost of support in Quebec right now.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at, as you say, this what's forming out at this point, at least, this two-horse race between Liberals and Conservatives, is this a region that's shifting? Is this a demographic that's shifting? I know you mentioned a little bit about the progressive vote, but in terms of, what regions this country or groups are carrying the Liberals higher up, what would you say to that?
It does seem like it's pretty broad-based. The Liberals are up among all the different age groups. They're now competitive with the Conservatives among young voters. They've moved ahead in most polls among older voters. They lead among women. The race is closer among men, with the Conservatives having the advantage. Regionally, the biggest swing has been in Atlantic Canada. There, the Liberals have jumped more than 20 points since Justin Trudeau's resignation. There's also been big jumps in British Columbia, where a lot of polls are now showing it a neck-and-neck race between the Conservatives and the Liberals. But you have to look even Alberta, the Prairies, Ontario, and Quebec. There has been that movement, double-digit movement for the Liberals since Trudeau's resignation. So there's a couple areas where it's particularly pronounced, but it's hard to find a part of the country right now where we're not seeing a big jump in Liberal support.
Okay, you say since the Trudeau resignation, but I was wondering how much of this has to do with the Mark Carney honeymoon, because traditionally there's a honeymoon after a new leader takes over a party, and in Mark Carney's case, there seemed to be a lift even when his nomination was being rumored, let alone confirmed and winning.
Yeah, I do think he is what is carrying the Liberals to this next level. Just before his became the leader, the Liberals were starting to get to the 30% mark with Justin Trudeau. There was a handful of polls that might have had the party higher, but that might have been baking in Mark Carney's leadership. But I think one of the things that's really boosting him forward is that his own personal numbers are actually quite high. On average, a number of polls that have had questions about positivity ratings, favorability ratings, Mark Carney's average positive score is 44%, so higher than where the Liberal Party is. So it does suggest that he actually could lift the party further up. So I do think that he is having an impact. And even when you compare who Canadians prefer to be Prime Minister between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, the gap between the two of them is bigger on that question than on the question between the Liberals and the Conservatives. So you're not looking at brand here. You are looking at Carney boosting the Liberals up to higher levels in the polls.
Okay, but does that popularity carry over into Quebec? Because, I'm thinking specifically about Mark Carney's proficiency in the French language. What do the numbers in that province say?
We do see the same kind of jump for the Liberals in Quebec, not as pronounced as we've seen elsewhere. And the Liberals weren't coming from, they didn't have the same base in Quebec they might have had elsewhere. But we haven't seen as much of a jump. But what is different in Quebec than what we've seen in the rest of the country is that the Conservative vote hasn't come down. So the votes that the Liberals have picked up in Quebec have come from the Bloc Québécois, unlike other areas where they came from both the NDP and the Conservatives. It does suggest that that vote might not be strongly sovereignist, strongly nationalist, so it could be, you know, pretty volatile vote. The quality of Carney's French, I think, will get profiled more and more as this campaign unfolds. I'm not sure if a lot of Quebecers have heard it. Not also sure it's going to make that much of a difference if the ballot box issue is Donald Trump and not, you know, the French language. But I think that the Liberals are vulnerable in Quebec, but for now, they're in a position to make gains.
Okay. Listen, there's also the choice here that we're essentially facing like the bare minimum of an election period, more 37, not the, what's the maximum, 51 days of the maximum length. Given how relatively short this campaign is going to be, how much change might we expect to see in the numbers?
We could see a lot. It's hard. You know, most campaigns you don't see that much movement. You know, the last few elections in 2019, 2021, the polls hardly moved once the writ dropped. But we remember 2015, 2011. You can have a lot of movement in a short amount of time. And I think that people are very engaged in this campaign. We saw some polling from Abacus showing that the interest in this election far higher than in 2021. So the fact that there's more engagement, the fact that there's more unpredictability, volatility coming from the United States, there is the potential for lots of change. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, and it doesn't mean it'll reverse the trends that we've seen so far, but this has been an unpredictable few months, and I would assume the next 5 weeks will be just as unpredictable.
Okay, well, luckily we have you booked. Éric Grenier, thank you for that. I appreciate the time.
Thanks.
Well, before we wrap up this evening, we should check in on the Leaders Tour, beginning with the NDP, as they were the first ones out of the gate this morning. Jagmeet Singh making a campaign announcement in Montreal, promising to build over 100,000 rent-controlled homes on federal Crown land across the country by 2035.
Our plan is, let's build 100% affordable homes on federal land across this country. Everywhere there's federal land, we want to see homes being built that are affordable. We want to hire and train 100,000 workers to build these homes, and we want to unleash the funding, the financing to make this happen. The difference is, here's the plans of the other guys. Pierre Poilievre wants to sell off federal land. He wants to sell it off, all of it, to rich developers and rich builders and build homes that you cannot afford. That's his plan. He wants to sell it off to companies like Mark Carney's former company so that they can make lots of profits, and they're not in it for you. And Mark Carney's plan, very similarly, he wants to sell off this land and build mostly homes that you can't afford. Neither of these guys are in it for you. So the question in this election is, who's going to build homes that you can actually afford?
As for the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, he started the day just outside of Toronto in the city of Brampton. This is where he promised to cut income tax if his party were to be elected.
This is a tax cut for the workers behind me who will pay 15% less on their income tax. This is a tax cut for the waitress, for the welder, for the barber. This is a tax cut for everybody who has ever got up early in the morning and worked hard to build our country. This is a tax cut that will put Canada first. We will do it by reducing the lowest bracket from 15 to 12.75, which is a 2.25% percentage point reduction, and that works out to a 15% reduction in the overall tax bill of everyone earning up to $57,000. That said, because we are cutting the lowest bracket, every single Canadian who pays income tax will pay less.
Liberal leader Mark Carney did not unveil any new promises today, but he did start this Monday in Gander, Newfoundland, where Carney talked about Canada's historic friendship with the United States and where it stands now.
In this crisis caused by the U.S. president and those who are enabling him, we lament a friendship lost, or at least a friendship strained. But we celebrate the Canadian strength we have reclaimed. And while in Gander, Canadians did extraordinary things for Americans when they needed it, now we need to do extraordinary things for ourselves. We will have to do things that we haven't imagined before at speeds we didn't think possible. And that means building millions of homes, building Canada into an energy superpower, building new trade corridors with reliable trading partners. It means a government spending less so Canada can invest more. It means making big polluters pay instead of hardworking Canadians, and creating one Canadian economy instead of 13.
The Bloc Québécois leader was in the Quebec capital today. Yves-François Blanchet promising to push a Buy Canadian, Buy Quebec policy for everything the federal government procures, although Blanchet was also asked about Liberal and Conservative promises to cut taxes. Here's what he had to say on that.
Bonjour, Monsieur Blanchet, du Canadian, CBC News. The main two political parties competing to form government are offering tax cuts in these early days of the election campaign. How do you compete with that as the Bloc Québécois?
I don't have to compete with that, but let me say something. How the hell do you intend to do that? One of the parties says we will cut the expenses. Okay, is it the right time to cut the expenses when the moment is more appropriate to support enterprise companies and jobs? And the other party says we will cut expenses and we will cut taxes. There's no way on earth one can manage that. You have to get more income to spend more. And if you do only cut and cut and cut, you will have to tell us where you will make those cuts. So it seems like instead of Mr. Carney convincing Mr. Poilievre to have a program, Mr. Poilievre has convinced Mr. Carney to have only slogans.
And finally, the Greens did not unveil any new policy or promise today, but we did hear from the party's co-leaders yesterday as Elizabeth May and Jonathan Pedneau made the argument for their candidates.
Nobody's voting for Jagmeet or Carney or Poilievre or Elizabeth and I.
Well, there's no ballot that has those names on one ballot.
Except in our respective ridings, right? We're electing members of parliament. We're electing the people who will be that we will be dealing with when we have problems with the federal government. When you have family members who need help with immigration matters, when you need help with navigating a complex system and a complex government, those are the people you want to go to. And sadly, I have to say, a number of times people end up sending members of parliament to Ottawa who really fail on that front. And they're not present in their community, and they don't serve the community the way Mike and Elizabeth do, by being on the ground, by responding to the queries of their constituents. That is the system that we want to bring forth, the option we quite frankly represent every day in our work, being there to leave no one behind. This is what Greens do, and I think Canadians will respond very positively when they get to know us for what we are. A party that really cares about them before caring about party and politics and whatnot. We care about Canada, we care about the people, and we want this country to work.
And we will continue to follow the Leaders Tour for you right here on Primetime Politics. But for now, that is it for Primetime Politics on this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We're back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.